And I think this is a terrific, it's fantastic we're able to share knowledge in this way. And what I want to say also, there's one of my former students, Vasco, is in the audience, and he was a student of mine in Dessau, where we ran this program that was very progressive at the time. It's no longer so, but it was very progressive, especially computationally. And what we attracted was students from all over the world, many of whom have been given places, offered places at the AADRL and other kind of very big name schools, but they couldn't afford to go there. So we ran what we termed at the time a poor person's AA, and it was good, because I think what I recognized after that experience of a few years was that they're the top 2% in any country in the world are talented. The top 2% anywhere. It's not a question of wealth or whatever. So we were able to kind of to provide some service. It was totally free, almost totally free in Germany, and it was in English, and it was a great experience. And in some ways, I see this as a continuation of that, to be able to offer for free some kind of education that people who otherwise would not have had have access to. And I'm just delighted that so many colleagues have come to risen to the call and donated their time for nothing. Well, it wasn't for nothing. I think there's a huge reward for doing this, maybe in a kind of personal reward. But I'm really grateful to, and they can't hear me, but the workshop leaders, who many of whom are very talented. Especially, I want to thank here Antoine and Sanford and Marrikka. And it's a wonderful to see this kind of this gesture from everyone at a time of such difficulties. Anyway, that's my thanks over. But I really hope that we can get a chance to go and have a discussion at the end today, and not just about what I'm going to say. I'm actually, it'd be good to have, while Sanford's around, to question him, and Marrikka and Antoine and so on. Let's just see what will happen. But I'm looking forward to that possibility. So maybe Antoine or Marrikka, is Sanford around yet? Sanford is.
No,
don't worry. He's
no, he's not yet there.
I don't see him.
Yeah, I've got to say,
he's not on the list yet.
It's Sanford. I mean, last night at Marrikka's session, well, it would have been morning for some other people, but Sanford came in and just offered a few words, and he kind of lit up the conversation in a way that only Sanford can. Wonderful. So it's kind of intimidating sharing a platform with someone as smart as Sanford, but it's great to have him around. It's great to have Antoine and Marrikka, and I hope you guys out there appreciate the quality of my colleagues I have here. It's a great honor to be on this platform. I mean, I'm thinking that maybe because we always constrained time-wise, that I should start anyway. So let me share my screen then. Hold on a second. I've got to did that wrong. Sorry, let me stop it a second. Is that visible now?
It is.
It is. Okay, great. So let's start. Today, this is my second talk, and it's in a way the other half of what I'm working on at the moment. The death of the architect. The story here was I was commissioned initially by the RIBA publications to look at the future of architecture and the impact of AI on architecture. And I thought about it for some time, and eventually the title emerged, a kind of very punchy title, The Death of the Architect. And the assistant for my editor at RIBA Publishing who wanted to publish this, wanted to commission me, thought, wow, what a fantastic title. But then Helen Castle, who is a wonderful editor, and she was, she sort of said, we can't say that. Our clients, I mean, basically RIBA is the Royal Institute of British Architects, and therefore they're all architects. They won't like to hear this. So anyway, in the end, I decided I would take it elsewhere. And halfway through, well, at the end of the summer, I was in Shanghai. And the final day, I suddenly realized this is kind of strange. I've got these two. I'm looking at this subject, which is both positive and negative. And of course, last time I was talking about the positive side of things. And this is the alternative title, I should say, for the first volume, which I've just finished. Alexa designed my building, and the other one was Possibility is the AI Design Revolution. But I guess the point is this: is that there is another side to that whole story. And this, like I mentioned this before, Gary Kasparov's kind of prediction: machines will eventually do everything better than us. So this is the title of the second book, which I've started on, and I'm been doing a lot of reading, but I haven't got to the point where I've digested the material in a certain way where I'm in a position to maybe offer my own theoretical take on top of the material I've been absorbing. I mean, I have a few ideas that are beginning to come out, but I think it's only at the end of a book when you really, the ideas crystallize. So this is not as theoretical as the first one. Eventually there will be some theoretical, there will be hopefully some deep theoretical insights in it, but it's kind of, I wanted to kind of put it out there though, just to go and lay out some of the kind of the arguments as to why the architect is, the profession of architecture, the discipline of architecture is in a certain peril. And this of course was commissioned, this was December last year, was commissioned before we knew about COVID-19. And I think we're in an even worse situation, partly because of that. And certainly if you were to Google the death of the architect, you'd probably come up with a list of well, I mean, we've lost some fantastic figures, including Michael Sorkin and so on. Anyway, so this is like the second half, and it's really looking at the dark side of AI. And there are many aspects to the dark side of AI, some of which I'm not going to deal with today. I'm not going to talk about surveillance, but some people see that as a very negative thing. I'm more ambivalent about that. But anyway, there certainly are a number of kind of comments about the risk, the danger that AI poses to the world, and people who often. It's not just Elon Musk who kind of make these comments, but there are many people who kind of like who are aware of that, who work in the field, who are very positive about AI, but at the same time kind of worry about its potential impact. Anyways, this is Stephen Hawking being one of those people. I've got to say, Stephen Hawking is someone very special to me. I bought my house from Stephen Hawking, which was a terrific experience in some sense. He couldn't sign the document; he had to put a thumbprint on it. And it's completely smudged, so you can't really see it, Stephen Hawking. But nonetheless, it was from Stephen Hawking. And I've always regarded him as a wonderful figure who's overcome adversity. Anyway, so Stephen Hawking is another one, along with Elon Musk. We have to be aware of the dangers of AI. I think, actually, frankly, that the Neuralink project that he's part of is actually maybe the most terrifying one. If you've ever read Zizek on Neuralink, you can find it on YouTube. If you just go and Google, you'll see why it's kind of terrifying. But Tesla here, the kind of Tesla car in space. This is I think that Tesla and SpaceX are both industries where are both firms where Musk is employing AI in great detail. So he knows about that side of things. So I want to start off in a kind of historical vein today with this character, Leon Battista Alberti, someone on whom I worked all those years ago. It was published in 1988, this translation by MIT Press. And it was a translation that I was, I was the geek who did the translation, right? So I was very young then. And anyway, Alberti, he translated from Latin. So it wasn't just Italian, it was from Latin. And in many ways, well, first of all, this is the first book to be published on architecture. Clearly Vitruvius wrote before, but this was the first book to be published. Alberti wrote this in somewhere around 1450. but it was published in 1485, I think it was, or somewhere around there anyway. And it was the first book on architecture. And what I want to say today is that not only was the first book on architecture, it was the first time when the architect was really properly defined. And it's on the first page of the first book on architecture to be published, that this definition of the architect that still holds to this day. I mean, things have changed, of course, but I mean, it still holds to this day. So I just want to point out on this page, there's this brief comment on the first page, which really is just a few lines, but it kind of captures the whole point of what Alberti was talking about. Sedanica ultra progredia. I won't read the Latin. Before I go any further, Kensi, I feel I should explain whom I would have you consider the architect, because I don't think it's the Tignarium Fabrum. It's not the carpenter whom I would have you compare to the greatest people in the other arts. The hand of the carpenter is but a tool for the architect. So it's like the carpenter, the work person is someone on site, the worker is but a kind of prosthetic extension of the architect. Him I call it is him, because all the architects then in those days were male. Him I call the architect who by a certain sure reason and method is able to devise in the mind and realize, operate by construction, whatever by the moving of weights and the joining of massing of bodies meets the noble needs of mankind. Now, that simple comment, it doesn't seem so special, but it's really very important, because what he's saying in this particular point is that the architect, the way we understand the architect, we have to move beyond the medieval understanding of the architects and redefine the architect. I mean, not just simply as a kind of, I guess, an intellectual or a figure. I mean, with the Renaissance, you've got this championing of the individual as well. But what he was kind of saying was that the definition of the architect in the Middle Ages it was thought that it came from the Latin, arcus and tectum, the idea that the arch, the guy who covered the arch, who built the truss, the roof, was the kind of leading architect. The kind of the master craftsman, shall we say, the master craftsman, and that was kind of reinforced at the time by attitudes towards carpenters. Joseph, Mary's husband, was himself a carpenter, and the idea was that if you were building the vault, the truss, the roof, you were closest to God, and so on and so on and so on. What he was saying here was it doesn't come from the Latin; it comes from the Greek, and the Greek term arc and tectum, we know that tectonics and so on means kind of building. An arc is, as an archangel, the chief builder. So the chief. So the architect is in charge of the whole thing, and is a kind of, as he puts it, a kind of like an intellectual in his own right, who devises in the mind and realizes through construction whatever might meet the noble needs of mankind. And this is important. This is important because it is the definition that we still hold today, even though in the 19th century, we went through it kind of the disciplines and the professions kind of mutated and evolved in their own particular way. We go back to this moment almost 600 years ago to find out the origin of the architect. So the death of the architect has already been proclaimed in many ways. Well, it has. This was an issue of 2015, an issue of the Architect's Journal, where members of Fashion Architecture Taste, who had already disbanded, Sean Griffiths, Charles Holland, and Sam Jacob, they came back together to announce the death of the architect. And they're all teaching now in various places. And it's interesting to see the way they put it. I mean, Sean Griffith basically says that really what we're entering into is something where it's about management. It's kind of entrepreneurial. It's about management speak, about risks and all these things and anybody who's worked, I think, in architecture will know that the kind of almost sentimental dream of the student about what an architect might be is kind of a myth when we find out when you work in an office. I remember when I finished translating Alberti, I went to work in an office, and my first job was in charge of the toilet schedule. It was kind of a come down. You go through architecture school, and each year you progressively get more ambitious. The first year maybe you do a house, second year you do a kind of school, third year you do a kind of new town or something like that, and then you end up being brought back down to reality in a profession that is nothing like what we had imagined. Well, at least what I had imagined anyway. Then I mean, San Jacob kind of echoes this in some way, and the notion, it's almost like it's been strangled, architecture, in his terms, I guess, by the logic of the profession itself. And I think it's important to really be aware of something that Sanford Anderson the comment that Anderson made about the difference between the profession and the discipline. They're very different, and I would say that, broadly speaking, the discipline is thriving in the world of academia, and the profession is struggling, even before COVID-19, struggling. So the profession is practice, and to my mind, the discipline is kind of the academic environment, where and it's kind of expanding. And if you've been to some of these schools like the Bartlett and very progressive schools, or the AA, the kind of things that are, and maybe also SCI-Arc and other places as well, what happens is really there is kind of like a proliferation of what architecture might be, what it might mean. And there are any number of investigations that go on that are really not really necessarily part of architecture. It just absorbs everything. But that's the problem. So this title of this book by Marrikka and Esther Choi, I think it's actually a brilliant title. I'm not sure everybody gets it, but I did. It's a double entendre, the French say. It has a double meaning. Architecture is all over. In other words, it is all over the place, everywhere. Everything becomes architecture. At the same time, it's all over precisely because of that, because it is everywhere. It therefore is kind of nowhere. It's finished. And that I take to be a kind of a take on Baudrillard's notion of this, of his, once everything becomes included in any particular category, that category disappears because there are no definitions. Sanford was talking about definitions yesterday, and without any definition, without any precise thing, if everything could be architecture, then nothing is architecture. And Baudrillard goes through a number of kind of tropes about it. Once everything becomes art, nothing is art. When everything becomes culture, nothing is culture. And he was kind of commenting, I guess, on the back of the Sensation exhibition that came out in London in the early 90s, where Damien Hirst had sharks and formaldehyde and things. What our notion of art was being expanded, exploded, distended to the point there was no real understanding of what it might mean. So at least that's my take, Marrikka, on your title, and I think it's a brilliant title. And so in a way, what's happened then is architecture, the profession has gotten more and more constrained and more turning into some kind of managerial project. And then the discipline has kind of exploded in a kind of like in many ways, a wonderful way. But once you do that, then you lose a sense of what it is to be architecture. I mean, I think I was probably guilty of that myself in the AD that Benaz Farahid and I put together 3D printed body architecture, because we noted that all these architects were working for Iris van Herpen, designing and fabricating 3D printed wearables, outfits, fashion items, which on the one hand was remarkable because it showed that architects actually have a kind of set of marketable skills that go way beyond beyond building. And we were trying to say, well, actually, in difficult times, we can expand, we can territorialize new spaces of the imagination, and fashion can become part of that. But that, of course, that also falls into the trap of actually then making architecture such a broad category that it's effectively meaningless. The question about the future of architecture, this is something that I really troubles me a lot. In a way, I don't know if anyone knows about the painting by Paul Klee, Angelus Novus, that Walter Benjamin acquired. And he talks about it an interesting way. He talks about how this is the angel of history, as he says. It's the angel of history that's going forward, moving backwards. And that, to my mind, is an interesting kind of comment in some senses, because that's what architecture is to my mind. No disrespect to those who are teaching history here at all, but what concerns me is in every school of architecture, there are so many history courses looking backwards, but I don't know any course. Maybe Liam Young does something that's more kind of perspective, looking forward, but very few attempts to be kind of futuristic or to understand in a serious way what the future of architecture might hold. And yet there is a discipline. There's a discipline out there. And furthermore, I think architecture is predicated on the future. Everything that we design is potentially could be built, potentially. And yet somehow we are still a very nostalgic discipline, in the sense that almost all of our work is looking backwards. So my part of the project about digital futures is to try and look forward to the future. These I always think are interconnected. I once heard a lecture by Wolf Pricks at SCI-Arc where he commented, today, tomorrow will be yesterday. Today, tomorrow will be yesterday. If you think about it, it basically means that the future and the past are in a way interconnected. So, but we don't think about it. And what we do get, I mean, this is a kind of typical example, the future of architecture in 100 buildings. Someone saying, well, let's look at the new design trends, and that's the future of architecture. I don't think it's about aesthetics. It's not about design trends. The future of architecture is something very, very different. So this is my profession about the architect. This is my impression of the architectural profession, just sticking its head in the sand in some ways. And it's kind of, what I'm doing, it's a mystery. It's already out there. In a way, it kind of reminds me in some ways of how attitudes towards COVID-19 or coronavirus as it was then, we all knew it was coming, and yet nobody did anything about it, or till too late. I would been following WeChat and all my colleagues in China, and you could pick up on something because, most of my Chinese colleagues don't exaggerate things. And when I really picked up on the fact this was something traumatic that was happening back in January. And yet in the West, we would stop paying any attention to what was going on. And I can recall we had eventually, I think at FIU, where I teach, we eventually started thinking about it. Oh, maybe we should have a meeting to discuss what we do if we have to kind of go online. And I was saying, why have a physical meeting? Why have a physical meeting? And they were saying, what are you panicking about? But of course, within a week, things had changed. So I think almost like this kind of head in the sand mentality is something that is way too, not just architecture. I think a lot of people are operating in that way. The writing is on the wall as far as I'm concerned. And one of the few groups that has actually attempted to address this is the RIBA, the Building Futures group that I belonged to for a while. And this is honest. This is actually quite honest. So honest that the RIBA removed it from their website because it was too honest in some senses. And there are a couple of comments I would make here. This on the front page here, there's a comment here. In 10 years, we probably will not call ourselves an architectural practice. It will be something else entirely. The reason for saying that is that what architects were finding increasingly was that they had to diversify, to go into product design, into all sorts of other forms of design, interactive design and so on, in order to survive. And the term architect was kind of holding them back. It was a too narrow definition of what they were doing, and therefore they were proposing to drop the term architect. But I think most of all, I mean, there are a number of, this is a kind of very brief report, and it's not exactly critical because it's just asking architects and clients and students and so on about this. But one of the interesting kind of comments that it makes is basically, and this is obviously just based on the UK, but it's saying that now over 50% of architects are working for developers. Now, just put this back in the context of Alberti, and you need to realize that at one stage Alberti was defining the architect with all the building worker, the on-site construction worker, as a kind of prosthetic extension, a tool in the hand of the architect. Now the architect has become a tool in the hand of the developer. So no longer the kind of Alberti's idea of the kind of this the leader of everything, this kind of the architect in drawing upon the Greek etymology. No longer the case. The architect has been displaced by other things, and of course we all know that only, well, I don't know where this figure comes from. Everybody refers to it, but 5% of all buildings are designed by architects. So we don't have much of a purchase on the market. We're a kind of marginalized group. And meanwhile, what you find is it's almost like it's some of these institutions are in their death throes in some sense, and they start squabbling among themselves. And there was a famous case when Renzo Piano, who designed this building, which is not quite as tall as it looks here, the Shard in London. There was a case when I think it was the ARB, and one of the institutions in London, the Architects Registration Board, said we can't call Renzo Piano an architect in England because he wasn't trained in England, which is totally absurd. And of course, we have the situation, especially in the States, where you can only operate in the state in which you are qualified, which makes no sense at all. Now we're in an international domain. And they have to have special, in Zaha Hadid architects, where most of their work is outside the UK, they have to have a special kind of qualifier to say what we mean by an architect. So anyway, so it's clear that already we're going to be able to see the architecture struggling. And this is obviously pre-COVID, I think 2013. Anyway, now, if you look outside, there actually are plenty, outside the discipline of architecture, there are plenty of books about the future of work, the future of the profession. And the point is that I guess we're all used to this kind of Amazon packaging factories, to this kind of Tesla car factories where there are no workers. It's all robots. There's no one to be seen at all. But the point that's been made in many of these commentators is that it's not just the blue collar workers, it's the white collar workers also who are at risk. The professions themselves are at risk in our contemporary moment. And it's not as though this is any secret. This book by Richard and Daniel Susskind was a Financial Times bestseller. It was out there, and what in a sense they argue is that in the end we just don't need this profession. I think this is remarkable, and in the long run we are on the brink of a period of fundamental and irreversible change. Technology will be the main driver of this change, and in the long run we will neither need nor want professionals to work in the way that they did in the 20th century and before. And the point they make is that the notion of the profession itself is based on a kind of social contract, what they call the grand bargain, where it's not enshrined in law necessarily. It's kind of like it's simply an agreement whereby architects are kind of trusted to design buildings, and frankly, they think that this will be eventually obsolete. That eventually we'll just abandon that grand bargain. And of course, so just the robots are gradually sort of moving in all sorts of territories now. IBM Watson that won the game of Jeopardy is now being deployed in healthcare. It's actually problematic at the moment that it's not quite worked out, but eventually it will. And it's proving incredibly accurate at things like, we've seen already at detecting COVID-19 and so on. So it's moving into areas. The profession of medicine is actually something that the prediction is that basically in the future we'll have kind of a medical assistants who are working with a computer, working with the AI that will be doing the job of architects. And the point being that AI can draw upon the entire medical history, not just of that patient, but of every single patient in the world, and is able to, for example, spot cancer in an X-ray and things in a way that is possibly superior to humans. I mean, there are other areas that it's not so good at the moment, but it's a question to kind of watch this space. So this is the kind of, I've got a whole stack of these books in my apartment, and there are many of them out there. The Rise of the Robots is another one, which was a New York Times bestseller. It's not a mystery, except to architects somehow. They don't seem to be aware of what's going on. Yeah, here we are. And Martin Ford takes this line. I mean, I think some people will dispute it, of course. But he does take a line and he says, listen, we've got to pay attention to this because there is something here we should be aware of, and that is the threat. What was interesting, this was 2016 that this was published. So I assume it was written in 2015, before all the issues about immigration came up with Trump and so on. And this, what he makes is this comment that it's, I find it so ironic that many conservatives in the United States are adamant about securing the border against immigrants who will likely take jobs that few Americans want, while at the same time expressing little concern that the virtual border is left completely open to higher skilled workers who take jobs that Americans definitely do want. And of course, it's become a campaign issue. Andrew Yang, the Yang Gang, has made it a kind of political question. And Obama was certainly aware of the risks and dangers of automation, as this quote says. So what happens in Martin Ford's book is that he describes this kind of moment. There's a kind of thought experiment he describes at some point where he moments that he talks about how Earth is suddenly invaded by a horde of extraterrestrial aliens whose primary motivation being useful work. I'll just quote here. The aliens have no interest in leisure, entertainment, or general intellectual pursuits. They have no concept of a home or personal space, private wealth, money, or private property, money, or wealth. Gradually, the aliens integrated into our society and economy. They are eager to work and demand no wages. And the aliens, of course, are robots. But what happens in Martin Ford's kind of prediction is that, you know, it kind of eventually it doesn't turn out so well. Unemployment begins to rise relentlessly. Competition for jobs increases. The public becomes increasingly fearful about the future. A small number of people have been doing extremely well as business profitability has increased. Sales of luxury goods and services are booming. For the rest, it's the dollar store economy. As more people become unemployed or become fearful they will soon lose their jobs, frugality becomes tantamount to survival. So basically, and then he talks about in the end how the whole economy is going to collapse because these aliens, which of course are robots, do not need to purchase anything. They certainly don't need to join the RIBA and other institutions, so they're almost the first to go. So the point is there is a deep-rooted, what he's predicting is a deep-rooted collapse of the economy. And what we've seen since then, and I think Martin Ford has already commented on this, how robots are taking over. They don't, you know, you don't get COVID-19 from robots. Well, maybe you can, but I mean, what we're seeing already is automation being advanced through this present crisis. And there are many studies that have been done. This is a study by some scholars at the University of Oxford, where they're looking at they actually use AI to calculate the impact of AI on jobs of the future, and they list out all the jobs in terms of the risk at which the risk of there being disappearing. And these are the ones at top end that choreographers and so on. These are the jobs that are fairly secure. And somewhere down here, I think it's number 78, architectural and engineering managers. I think there's also another one of architects. Yes, number 82, architects except naval, landscape and naval. 82, they're quite high up on the list, relatively, because once you get down to number 702, telemarketeers, they're not marketers, they're going to disappear entirely. So it kind of, it's offering relatively reassuring news for architects in that the calculation they're making is whether AI is going to displace architects one for one. And there are other calculations here. You can see it doesn't affect all professions equally, although you don't show architects here. Clearly, some are more at risk than others. Sewers at the very bottom, they're gone. Animal trainers, surprisingly, I think I don't sure that animal trainers are that safe either, actually. but I guess what they're saying, I mean, this is not the future, right? When we're talking about AI, we're not talking about android robots in an office with you, stealing your job kind of thing. In fact, AI, as I mentioned before, is completely invisible. It's kind of embedded in our phones. It's all over the place. But if you want to think about AI, don't think about robots or android robots. Think about algorithms, completely impossible. But it's here in these kind of things. This is Xcool's app for a phone, where you can log on through the cloud, and all these things are possible. The point is, what they didn't in this study in Oxford, they didn't take into account is that it's not just a one-for-one replacement of an architect with a robot. What we're talking about here is is it an extended intelligence? And everyone's talking about extended intelligence rather than AI. It's extension. It becomes this kind of cyborg-like prosthetic extension to the human capacity, and so what the potential that is there, that's maybe already happening, is not a one-for-one replacement, but rather that one person with one of these apps can do the job of 20 people. So the kind of typical office I worked in after completing the Alberti translation, there were 25 of us in an office space working on this project. That will go down to, I don't know, 3 or 4 people, maybe less, working with AI as a kind of prosthetic extension. So even though it's not a one-for-one replacement, nonetheless, as soon as it becomes a tool that takes potentially other job of others, you can see that it's going to lead to some degree of declining jobs. The question, I mean, last time I was talking about how computers can be creative, and there's an open question as to how we define creativity and whether computers are really creative. And certainly, I don't think they're aware of their creativity, at least. Nonetheless, we can see that they can generate a number of things. And I want to go back also to this one particular moment. I was talking about the AlphaGo game between the game of Go that was played between AlphaGo and Lee Sedol, this particular move 37 in game number 2, which I think is astonishing in all sorts of ways, not just because it was a novel move, but it changed the whole discourse of Go. It changed the game itself. And I'm going to say that this, just as a kind of an aside, but this is how it's going to affect architecture. It's going to bring in a range of solutions we hadn't even thought about. And that's what the impact I think is going to be. It's going to open up the range. It's going to transform the discipline of architecture in the way that I think that AlphaGo transformed the game of Go. So in my mind, the question is whether architects are so creative themselves. And I don't know. I mean, we like to think we're creative, right? But when you think about it, I often use this example with my students. If a student were to come forward with a design that looks like a pineapple, someone would kind of look at it and they would say, "Are you sure you want to be an architect?" But if you do something a little bit like Rem Koolhaas or Herzog de Meuron or Zaha Hadid or Norman Foster or whatever, a little bit, not the same, but a little bit like it with a slight variation, that's architecture. And that's why I think about architecture as jazz. There's a kind of background condition, and we're kind of playing off against that. It's kind of interesting, though, because AI can also do that. This is an example of CAN, a creative artificial network, a version of GANs. This is Mario Klingman, the painting, inverted commas, that won the Lumen Prize. And the way that CANs work is that they draw upon the data set. The trouble about most GANs is that you could only get something out from what you put in, and therefore, if there's a fixed data set, you're not going to get anything novel out, except for CANs introduce some kind of variation, so that what you get is not constrained to that data set. So you get some kind of invention. And in many ways, as has been pointed out by several people, that's really what art is about. And I think architecture too, just a kind of variation on a theme. But there were other kind of comments that came in. I think this is astonishing. The point about that move that caught people unaware because they thought it was a mistake, and then they began to realize the sheer genius, the genius of also others, what they call slack moves. They couldn't comprehend the genius of the moves until the game unfolded, and they began to realize, my goodness, that was so creative. And Lee Sedol comes up with this comment that AlphaGo showed us that moves humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. I think that's a really important point. And then that was right after the match, and then a year or so later, he retired. He says, this is an entity that cannot be defeated. And the point I guess I want to make is that part of the problem here is we're talking about, if you look over history, there are many kind of tools that that are invented that are kind of assimilated, and we can accommodate them and deal with them. But the one crucial difference is that AI learns, and it learns actually at a level, a way in which we cannot comprehend. So after AlphaGo, they developed AlphaGo Zero, and there are a number of different models they've been through, infinitely more powerful than AlphaGo itself. And this comment, just blows you away. That AlphaGo Zero was able to play 4.9 million games against itself in 3 days. It's the kind of the speed of operations, which is happening. It works out of one game every 20 games a second. It's just mind-blowing. There's no way that we can compete with this thing. This is actually reinforcement learning. It's teaching itself to play Go by playing against itself at Go. I don't know how long a game of Go takes, but you certainly can't do 20 games in a second. Anyway, so the key question, I want to just mention this as a kind of the issue that people say, well, okay, but hold on a second. It might be able to play Go, but doesn't even know it's playing Go. It might beat the world champion at chess, Kasparov, but it doesn't know it's playing chess. And this is the argument that John Searle, a philosopher in Berkeley, makes. He's called the Chinese room experiment. And basically what he's arguing is to say that, well, what if we were to replace the operations of a computer with a human just going through the kind of process and with a set of instructions and working in a standard way, and replace the computer with that, and then people on the outside, it's kind of Turing test in some senses. Whoever or whatever is in that room is an intelligent Chinese speaker, but the point is the guy in the room doesn't understand a word of Chinese. He or she is just following this kind of instructions, as it were. And this is the point. And at the moment, AI might be incredibly clever and intelligent in some senses, but it's not aware of its intelligence. It doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't know what it's doing. So from that point of view, most people would say, well, okay, until that happens, and it happens when we get to what's called AGI, artificial general intelligence, until that happens, we're okay. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, this is Sophia as a humanoid robot that was kind of famous a while back because, should I call it she or it? I don't know. Was presenting itself as though it was a kind of a sentient being, and actually it's not. It's a robot. And I think a lot of people in the industry are very angry about this particular example because it's trying to fool people into thinking that we have AGI, artificial general intelligence. We don't have that yet. And this is kind of like a marketing opportunity. And I want to say that this is the kind of key problem in some senses of AI, because it's invisible. We don't know if it's there or not. People are increasingly being cynical, and there's one particular architectural practice that has AI in its title, and they don't use AI. It becomes the ultimate marketing opportunity. And let's not forget that many of these things, and this particularly Sophia itself is a kind of rather cynical marketing opportunity for Hanson Electronics, a company based in Hong Kong. Many of those things, even the game of the match of Deep Blue against Garry Kasparov, was really about showing off the potential of AI to investors. It wasn't so much about that, because in fact, computationally, it was, in terms of AI, it wasn't so advanced. It was about marketing, and I think this is the kind of the dirty secret that we have to be aware of. Beware the AI of marketing, because there's a risk of it being exploited. I'll cut out that because I was going to show you Will Smith having a date with Sophia, which is kind of entertaining, but let's just carry on. So what I think we need to engage with is what I call the second Copernican revolution. We need to realize that I mean, Pythagoras was someone who kind of once commented that man is the measure of all things, which is something that I think Alberti had taken on board, the idea that the architecture itself had to be kind of model on human proportions. We had to see the world in relation to the human. And what I want to suggest is we have to abandon the idea of judging AI on the basis of human performance. we have to abandon the kind of Turing test model, that is to say, you're convinced by AI if it matches human performance. I mean, in the end, who cares about human performance? So Zizek has an article that one I gave you last time that I hope you got it anyway. Where he argues, well, but what if reality itself is a simulation? What if reality itself is a simulation? And what if, this our idea of what we're talking about in terms of consciousness, what if that's just simply a kind of simulation of the world? And we know this from neuroscientists increasingly, that actually it's a kind of, Anil Seth, and I really hope that you get a chance to look at the panel discussion involving Anil Seth and Refik Anadol, because it's absolutely fascinating. Anil Seth, who's one of the world's leading computational neuroscientists, he did actually a PhD on AI, so he knows what he's talking about in terms of AI. And he's basically saying that what we have is our brain is locked into this kind of into this kind of the skull and not aware of anything. And it has to have its best guess of what's going out there. It has to kind of model, predict, and so on. So perception is a kind of form of prediction, as I was saying last time. And as Zizek also says, it's a kind of like it comes to us through fantasy. Let's not assume that we are engaging with the real world itself. So if already our understanding of the world is a kind of model of the world, then maybe we need to kind of like abandon this idea that we are engaging with reality itself. I would claim that at this stage, we need to sort of also go through a kind of second Copernican revolution. Not only is the Earth not the center of the universe, but human beings are not the center of the universe. Yuval Harari makes some really beautiful comments about that. That not everything goes through the straits of consciousness. Who cares in some senses about that? There's a famous comment about a Google car that was in an accident, and it's almost like consciousness was the problem, because the human driver in that car crashed with the self-driving car, and it was maybe the human driver was distracted, thinking about, I don't know, some phone call or something, or what he or she was going to have for supper, or whatever. Distraction in a way. Almost consciousness is actually a bit of a hindrance from that point of view. But there's another kind of, I think, comment which I think that it is even more interesting in some senses. The real problem with human beings is that we are so convinced of our own intelligence, we can't imagine anyone doing. What they can't. We have no perception of what AI can achieve. If we measure it constantly in terms of what we can do, we've got no clue. Absolutely no clue what it can do, just as we were kind of surprised by AlphaGo and Move 37. And Alan Turing comes up with a wonderful comment about, he's just speculating in a way about what AI could be doing, what computers could be doing. And he goes down to the point where he says, it can even, write sonnets, which of course was something that Ada Lovelace didn't believe in. She didn't think that AIs could do that kind of thing. It could only do what it was kind of programmed to do, but clearly it can learn. And Alan Turing comments on how he is frequently surprised by what the computer can do. But he makes this comment, he can write sonnets. He says, though the comparison is perhaps a little bit unfair, because a sonnet written by a machine will be better appreciated by another machine. I mean, when I first read that, I thought, okay. But now I thought about it and think, well, actually, that's probably true. We couldn't even conceive of the brilliance of things that AI could do, because we are unaware of it. We can't even grasp this kind of what goes into AI itself. So I'm going to finish off by kind of predicting, making some comments on the prediction about the future of AI. And what I would say is that AI is all about prediction, about recognizing patterns and predicting the future. And in many ways, human beings also are kind of prediction machines. We also are good at recognizing patterns. And in fact, Ray Kurzweil, who is the kind of the chief provocateur, shall we say, of AI and futurism, and in many ways outrageous in what he says, but the trouble is he's been correct so many times in his predictions that you can't ignore him. He makes a number of predictions about what AI is going to be able to do. I've lost my train of thought. It'll come back to me in a moment. But anyway, there are a number of kind of stages that can be mapped out in terms of the future of AI. Where we are at the moment is narrow AI, as I mentioned last time. It's AI without consciousness. the next step is what Ray Kurzweil calls the singularity, which is largely a kind of product of the what he calls the law of diminishing returns, or I think it's called. It's not just Moore's law, but it's a variation of that, whereby he's predicting that we have exponential growth, just as the exponential growth of the virus and so on was happening. We have exponential growth, and we're going to get to the point what he calls a singularity, where there's an explosion of intelligence, an eruption of intelligence across the universe. And shortly after that, we will reach the point of what he calls AGI, artificial general intelligence. He predicts, and the last prediction he made was 2045. He's actually much more kind of, I wouldn't say optimistic, I'm not sure what the word is, but most people don't predict it until much later. The general consensus is being closer to the end of this century, more like 2099 or around then. But most people also think that eventually it's going to be possible to get artificial general intelligence. So it's Ray Kurzweil. So the comment I was going to make was that Ray Kurzweil thinks that actually in How to Build a Mind, I think one of the books, is that the title of one of his books? Anyway, one of the books he writes, he talks about how prediction is an essential part of how we survive, and he talks about the primitive cave person who's walking in the wild, sees a wild animal that's going to cut across his or her path, and therefore takes a different route. And that idea of prediction, you can predict there's danger. It's a survival mechanism in human beings. Anyway, so the AGI, hugely controversial. We don't have it at the moment. It's just a fiction in the cinema, like Sophia or you know, in those kind of domains. Eventually that will come. Then we'll meet the point of what's called superintelligence. Nick Bostrom, a philosopher working at the University of Oxford, is very worried about the possibility of superintelligence. And then ultra-intelligence was very similar to the notion of superintelligence, predicted back in the 1960s by a British mathematician, Irving John Good. He comments that basically at some point, we get to this point we've made human beings make the last invention they can make, which is basically a machine that can design and build other machines. And as it's learning, the point is that's it in a way. What I would love that and maybe Chao could put the YouTube link on the discussion here. But what I would love, so one of the most interesting things that came out of this entire event, Digital Futures World, was an interview or a panel discussion that I had with the two leading companies working on AI and the future of the office. One being a company in Norway called Spacemaker, and one being XCool in Shenzhen. And it was a remarkable discussion. I think super interesting. I mean, really, really interesting. And in a way, I guess the conclusion I came to after all this was and reading up on the matter is of course we are amazed by what can be produced by AI, by GANs particularly. My students at FIU using it. Daniel Bolajan was kind of teaching us, and he was part of that as well. He's teaching at FAU. He's running a workshop here. I think there are 12 workshops on AI. So anyway, what's being produced, and I think Marrikka will attest to this, there's some really amazing things coming out. At SCI-Arc in particular, Casey Ream is really quite a genius at AI. Some amazing things coming out, and also Damian. But in a way, I don't think that's going to be the future of AI. What I think is going to be more important are these tools. Now, it sounds kind of boring in some way, but actually, one of the comments that came up, Håvard Håkland commented to say, basically, increasingly clients are demanding that the architects use their AI tool, Spacemaker. And although he doesn't quite say this, I can see that in the future, they will demand it because it will maximize the profits. It will be able to realize the most profitable design for any particular site. And it will also be able to offer a kind of a model for how the building will perform. And it'll optimize both the design, the site potential, and also the performance of the building. And they're demanding that. They're going to demand that. And I look down the road, what I think is going to happen is that's going to be the game changer. Architects themselves, they've got no power. We just kind of, I think of architects as hairdressers. You go to a hairdresser, you say, I want a short back and sides, and then give you a short back and sides, right? I mean, I don't think architects really have much authority in this at all. And the clients are going to be saying, no, I want you to use AI, and that's going to become the issue. And it's going to become the issue because as that becomes the case, then we'll get into this cynical situation, and both Harvard and Wan Yu He, who are in the discussion, are very nervous about this, and they think it'd be sad if it happens. But I think we'll get to the situation where architects will start branding themselves on whether they use AI. And as I said before, you don't know whether AI is being used or not because it's invisible, but it becomes, at that point, the ultimate branding opportunity, And I think that my prediction is that what we'll end up with is a kind of, it's branding, just as we have sustainability now. And in fact, LEED certification is a kind of cynical thing because LEED buildings are not really very environmentally conscious, but nonetheless, you have to do that. And many people try and sell themselves on how LEED conscious they are. And I think the same is going to happen with AI. That's what's going to be the principal driver of change. I'm absolutely convinced of that. So I want to finish off with a discussion about how we're going to view AI and how it's going to impact on the profession. This is something that I want to pay attention to the sign on the left-hand side, the horseless carriage. When cars were, well, what we now know as cars were first produced in 1899. Well, I don't know when they were first produced, but this is obviously from 1899. Is that right? I don't know. Anyway, they were called horseless carriages. Why were they called horseless carriages? Because we had carriages. We had horse-drawn carriages, and that's what the main method of transportation was. As these horseless carriages became more popular, so they started to be called cars. And what was known as a carriage before had to be specified as a horse-drawn carriage. In other words, our terminology shifted as they became more dominant. We can see a kind of similar thing happening in the world of the architectural office. Initially, when CAD drawings came out, when computer-aided design kicked off, we referred to CAD drawings, and the term drawing was assumed to automatically be kind of rotating pen, a standard kind of hand drawing, as it were. That's what a drawing was. But now, as CAD has kind of become extensive, that almost nothing is produced that isn't produced on a computer. So we just call them drawings. And we refer to human drawings as hand drawings in a kind of slightly romantic way. So it goes on, and I think soon we'll be in the situation, just to take the model of the car. This is a prediction by Toby Walsh, who's maybe not as imaginative as Ray Kurzweil. Really pushes the boundary, and I really would recommend having a look at Ray Kurzweil. Some of his predictions are absolutely astonishing, and I think 86% have been correct. But this is a little lame in some ways, Toby Walsh's predictions. And I don't think machines can think. I think the title's completely wrong. Machines cannot think. They don't have consciousness. Without consciousness, you can't do certain things, and thinking is one of the things you can't do. But nonetheless, he makes this comment: we won't be allowed to drive cars anymore, and we will not notice or even care. The self-driving car will come along, and his argument basically is that humans will the insurance premiums will go up because humans are will be less reliable than self-driving cars, and in the end, we'll lose those skills. And in a way, what he's kind of saying is actually we won't even notice or care. The change that happens, it's a bit like the story about boiling a frog. I've never boiled a frog, and I wouldn't want to, but the story is that only way you can boil a frog is by starting off at a kind of a low temperature and gradually increasing. The frog doesn't notice it until it's boiled. Whereas if you drop a frog into boiling water, it'll leap out again. So we won't even notice. We will not even notice that or even care about the fact that we don't drive cars anymore. Now, the model of the self-driving car basically has made the driver redundant. Strangely, it's also a model that Harvard Hoagland wants to promote for Spacemaker. And yet, if you think about it, that is dangerous because, just as the driver becomes redundant, so will the architect become redundant once you're in a situation whereby it can design itself. And my point is this: as it's learning, AI knows already our musical tastes from Spotify and things. It knows everything, and it won't take long before we're in a situation where it'll produce a design that it knows that we like. anyway, this is going to be, it's already implied in some senses in the title. I'm going to go and skip out of this a second, and I want to share you something else, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, and I enjoyed this discussion a lot. And it's because over the last few weeks or so, the last few days, I've been talking about AI on different forums. I don't repeat myself. Well, I'm going to just play a little section where, hold on a second. Have I got the right one here? Sorry. Excuse me a second. Is that it? That's not it. Let me just, sorry, excuse me. I've managed to, just a moment. Give me a second.
Marrikka.
Okay. Here we are. I hope I can see this on my screen. At the moment I can't for some reason.
A long way to go into doing what humans really want to do and what they should do and what.
I'm not sure what's happening here. I can't see this on my screen, which is a bit of a shame. I don't know why that is. Okay, it's not that one. It's not that one. Okay.
What they are needed for.
Okay. Okay. This is unfortunate because this is a really beautiful speech, and I can't locate it on my screen, so I can't share it. I don't know why that is.
Neil, we can hear it. Would it make any difference if you just played it and we heard it?
Yeah, let's do that then. Let's just play this. It's yes. Why not? Actually,
and I think that will be more aligned in the future, because right now I know so many. I mean, I can't tell you how many hours I've been sitting late doing stupid calculations or building stuff that I felt like I wasn't using my brain in the right way. Like I was just producing like stupid things, and I wanted to test 100 ways of developing a site, and I only had capacity to test two because of the lack of tools and the processes, and I didn't have the information, etc. So this will definitely help us, but we're not even close to seeing anything that would replace the architect, right? It's just a much needed leap towards a better way of doing things, right?
I'm wondering, because when I was a student, I can recall, for example, I'd go on a vacation somewhere, and first of all, I'd go to a travel agent, and I would sit down and talk to the travel agent, and they would fix something, and then I would go to a camera shop and I would buy some films for my camera, and then when I came back from my vacation, I would go and take my films to be processed, and then I'd wait 2 weeks and I'd get my films back, and so on. And in a way, I'd never imagined that would change. But we don't really have many travel agents these days. We book our flights online. We don't process films that we use digital. They're all automatically produced digitally. In fact, actually, camera shops have gone out of business because most mobile phones have cameras in them. So I don't know whether we can be so guaranteed the potential future of the profession of architecture. And I just know it could well. I think one use idea of this slightly sentimental sort of view, but we look back and maybe there will be some special projects for architects, but they'll be more expensive. And I think somehow, for example, again, when I was a student, you'd have these things called telegrams. People would get married and they would send a telegram, and it would be, a quaint old-fashioned technique. And now a handwritten letter is kind of like that. It's a kind of charming old blast from the past, And I'm wondering whether, all of this actually was going to lead to a bit where we have a sort of nostalgic sort of thing. Just to go back to the metaphor of the car, at one point, a car was called a horseless carriage, then cars became
Sorry, I'm repeating
kind
this.
of popular, more popular than a horse and cart, and the carriage was no longer called a carriage, but was called a horse-drawn carriage, and then we had cars. So actually, I'm just sort of wondering whether, in the end, with the self-driving car, we're going to have these kind of human-driven cars, would be kind of romantic things that maybe if you get married, you go and you be driven in it and things. And I just wonder. I mean, I'm not so sure that we can guarantee that the architect in the future is going to be what we were brought up with, and maybe it's not such a bad thing. One of the interesting kind of points made in one of the books that I've been reading was about self-driving cars. Is they were saying, well, eventually it'll be too expensive for insurance-wise to have humans driving because they're less reliable, and then human driving will fade out. And maybe we won't even notice.
I'm repeating myself. I'm sorry.
I never noticed the end of travel agents and camera shops. I'm just wondering whether soon we won't even notice. The architect will be phased out and something else will be there. Anyway, that's a provocative way to end.
Yeah, it's also, I'm probably in the same provocative, mind right now. Like, if we are going back to that kind of, is AI going to make things easier, or we are going to have super users? For me, it's like depending on the process that AI is applied and the period that we are talking about. If you are talking long-term, personally, I think we have AI that makes things easier. Short-term probably is going to be the super user because, again, we are still engaging, even if we have AIs that are helping us design-wise, we still have a lot of other processes that are pretty much hands-on, a lot of data and stuff that you have to process, client relations and so on. Yeah. But then when it comes to this idea of, is the architect going to go away? I know that we don't want to give up on that. As architects, we want to be still in control. And I think it's important for us to make the distinction when we talk about tools and history. The thing is, the tools that we had in history, they are not AI. They were not tools that were able to learn by themselves. And that's a huge distinction because we cannot anymore follow the history in a way lesson, because the history, you're using a pen. A pen is nothing but a tool, but you cannot compare a tool with an AI. A pen with an AI, you cannot compare it, yeah. Because an AI is going to learn by itself, yeah. And this is a software that also creates software in the end. There are already like softwares that are created by AI. So, and then it's also another point that I want to make is also we have this kind of idea that still architect has to interact with a client. If you are thinking, it was the same discussion when they had this kind of counselors, AI counselors. So it was only a bot, and you'll just have a counseling in a way session with a bot. And initially the idea was that that's not going to work because humans, they need in a way other humans to in a way confess or open up or something to discuss their problems. And actually the researchers, what they found out that actually people are more open when they are talking with an AI bot than they are open when they talk with a human counselor, yeah. And right now also here in the US, there are a lot of not experiments, I think there are bots that are used for PTSD treatment, yeah. And many of those humans, they are more open to talk with those bots because of all the crazy things that happen to them, yeah. And for them, it will be very hard to open to a human, for example. And then it's much easier to open to a AI bot. So I think also when it comes to, we have to understand if we talk short term, then probably now we still have a sort of we still have a sort of architect driving the processes and interacting and so on. But long term, like talking about 40, 50 years from now, I would say probably AI is going to take over a lot of things. And probably what we define today as an architect is going to be something else, yeah, but not the architect that we think of today. Yeah. I understand that there are a lot of aspects that still need to be worked on, because, for example, as humans, you have so many, your perception in a way, it's influenced by so many stimuli in a way. So also your body chemistry, and then environment, and then experience, and then history and stuff, yeah. And at one point, I think we are going to get to that phase where AI actually is going to have all those senses, yeah. And yeah, game over.
I think it was Jack Ma. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was Jack Ma who made two very.
Okay, why am I not able to share this? Can you hear me? Oh dear, I seem to have lost. Can
we see your screen?
Okay.
Neil.
Okay. Let me just try one more time to get this back again. For some reason it's not letting me. Okay, stop sharing, and then I'll share again. I don't know why it's not showing me the previous thing. Okay, well, maybe I can carry on. This is very strange. I don't know why. What can you see now? Okay, well, what I was going to show you. So can I just ask you what you can see now?
We see a Zoom screen.
Okay.
But, you know, a capture with excluding yourself.
Well, I don't need the final two images, but I was going to say the game over image. I think I just showed you just now. I think this is I mean, what I want to say, I'm not sure Sanford was here at the very beginning. I'm not trying to theorize today. I just want to lay out some kind of information that might allow us ourselves to kind of think about this potential future. I found that comment by Daniel Bolojan, who is one of the people in it who really knows about AI. He's working with Wolf Pricks and he's doing Deep Himmelblau. He's teaching a course right now, one of the geniuses in the world of architecture in terms of AI. That idea of game over was to me a kind of like, that's it, you know, maybe it's a provocation and so on, but I think that potentially is going to be the situation. I think that, you know, the comments that were going on in the discussion beforehand was saying that, that I will get rid of the sharing, that was saying that, that what's going to happen is maybe there will still be these specialist architects. They'll be very expensive. They'll be kind of star architects. They will still be employed. So they will still be popular. And of course, there's always the kind of resistance to some of these kind of technologies. I think you could see how people sometimes deliberately resist the kind of onslaught, as it were, of technology. But I think the point is that ultimately we're heading towards a situation whereby we really don't need the architect. So what happens in the future, and I would say probably by 2050, we might be in that situation. And I think it's really important because many of the people here are either listening are either students or whose career will be at the high point then, or indeed they will be teaching and teaching students who will be going into a profession that may not have much of a future. And I think it's really important to be aware, or at least of the danger, whether or not this actually happens, to be aware of the danger in this situation. So what I want to suggest is that there is a risk that some 600 years after Alberti has defined what the architect should be, some 600 years after that, from the very beginning of the architect and the definition from Alberti through to the point where AI potentially takes over, that would, to my mind, potentially is the era of the architect, and it might be coming to an end. The beginning was Alberti, and the end is potentially AI. Now, the big irony is that Alberti's own name begins with A and ends in I. Okay, I'll leave it at that point there. And maybe we can get into a discussion. I'm somehow lost in my, I'm lost in my screen somewhere. Now, again, I'm not trying to be theoretical here. That'll come later. But I just do think that we've laying those facts out there What I do think astonishing is I don't think we have any clue about the potential about what AI can do. And nor will we, because it will be beyond our comprehension. There'll be a level of intelligence out there that we simply can't measure in human terms. It's very undialectical, this. I mean, my whole idea is I was kind of putting my first lecture was positive about AI, and this is the negative side of things, but I think we should be aware of both. Anyway, my apologies for not being able to match the kind of the theoretical insights of Sanford today, but it's kind of work in progress in a sense, but I wanted to lay out some findings that I came across that I think make this whole question interesting in a way. So, I'm sure there'll be people who violently disagree with this. I'm sure.
Let me stand in for those. Let me stand in for those.
Yeah.
I'm being heard. Well, first of all, let me say this. Number one, and please listen, please wait for the period. Please wait for the end of the sentence before you allow any hormones to shoot into your body. I would like to say, first off, that what we saw just, at least especially in the first half of your presentation, was an atrocious parade of platitudes. And I would like to say, however, that what I take it to be that you are saying behind what you are saying is that as a profession, as a field, we have even failed to take into account those platitudes. And I absolutely agree with that. Now, you did say at the outset that you were not going to, that you were going to kind of reserve an opening, let's say, that would be non-theoretical in order to put some information down on the table. And I think that in a sense, you inoculated yourself from any, shall we say, criticism or responsibility, shall we say, that goes beyond a moral responsibility. But I would say I need to say it because I know we got an audience. And by the way, I'm fascinated by the demographics of the audience. I scroll through it once or twice per session, and I notice that we're pretty close to like 3% Americans. And I think that's something that, in a way, the incredible shift in center of gravity away from the historical Americanocentric one, thanks to the incredible loss of prestige all across the board in American psyche, I would have to say, is a fascinating one, even though America goes full speed ahead, at least in their anxiety about falling behind in AI. I think it's a fascinating thing that the American position is in such decline. Now, I'd like to say that thing about the platitudes is that at the same time, it's important to be said that a lot of the people you invoke, and I'm not going to put any judgments on them, there were a lot of quacks, and there are a lot of fog producers among the parade of commentators that you presented. I say that not as a criticism in any way, but merely so that because it's, well, because the speakers always seem to have a kind of a position of authority, as opposed to those who have to sit docile and listening. And they might think that there was a kind of tacit, implicit direction in that. I think it's important to kill the fathers. And I'd like to say that at least there is some, they will at least have heard that there is some dissent as to the worthwhileness of a lot of those commentators. Now, I haven't read as much as you. I want to say that right now. But I will say this. 20 years ago, I used to teach the history of technology. In fact, as a Canadian, I would have to say that that was the fundamental gateway to thinking about anything, because Canada, as the Canadians always used to tell themselves, Canada as a national entity was a fundamentally technological unity. That's to say that Canada never really was a country, not until the advent of as the Canadian story is, the advent of the railroad, which made the Confederacy possible, and so on and so forth. Satellites were very important in Canada, as was television, and Canadian use of television and radio, by the way, was so different from the way it was used and integrated to create a kind of a national psyche. But it's also true that our greatest philosophers, and let's just say the greatest, we had economic historians in Canada who were profound thinkers, shockingly profound compared to what passes in America as a philosophical tradition, but who were very largely focused on the way in which territory and economics interacted through specific things. And then you guys would be amazed to note that the entire story of Canada and of economics and ecology was articulated through the use of the snowshoe and the bear trap. And this became the framework in the work of somebody named Harold Innis for a way of understanding all of history in terms of the operators and the way in which, let's just say, consciousness and everyday life was organized, first through technology and then through the economic world that technology basically makes possible. There is no economic organization without technical organization underlying it. I have to say that right off the bat, but I would also like to say that I don't agree with the, I would just say, I don't think it's good enough, the attention grabber title that you used about the death of the architect. That too is a platitude to which we have become completely inured. But I also think it's it's not the best way of redirecting attention. And I will say just in passing that I would find it a lot better for a kind of a comment, or shall we say a kind of provocation, like the age of the computer is over. It just so happens that I deeply do believe that, but I also believe that that's an inseparable, that I would like to say that that lies as a foundation actually in your own argument. I'm going to ask you to think about that a little bit later, because it's a place where I do believe there is a great subterranean agreement between us. When I say the age of the computer is over, you're going to say, well, what the fuck does that mean? But that's something I go on about constantly in classes and increasingly in writing, especially writing that I've not yet published, but that will come. But people will want to ask, well, how could that be? What could possibly be an organizing principle? Or what could possibly be something we could recognize in the world around us, which is already incipient, already emerging, shall we say, already palpable, let's say already doing its initial work, if you like, of beginning to redirect energy, attention, and sensibility. And I would say that very word itself is the senses. I think it's very important to understand. I think it's very important to at least assess whether or not the senses are something that are basically bringing, are the topic that we really need to begin first to identify in language, secondly, to elaborate in concepts, and then thirdly, begin to address and begin to ask ourselves how we can use it, how we can do it. And also, of course, because that changes the interface through which we will begin to understand what is in fact playing itself out today in AI. We haven't even identified, not only we don't understand AI, as you point out, we don't really understand because we have failed in to describe the current context, the current material, sensory material context in which AI is operating. That type of description is the work of the theorist. It's the work of those who work in the design field. And there is an abdication that we need right there to address. Maybe that is also because we don't yet have access to, or yet we haven't really felt it was our obligation first to address the platitudes before we kick them away. I would like to say, just in passing, because I want to provoke also the audience members, I understand they got a lot to say, and I see just how mature and interesting they are as a group to be addressing. And I have to say, it's a great failure so far. I will consider it a great failure if we don't get to turn the Zoom around and listen to what is brewing in their minds. But I would like to say that, you know, my son happened to go to a school in which there were some of the world's greatest Go players, and he became extremely proficient at Go at a very young age. And one of the things I noticed in his training at Go was it did something to his brain very early in life. And I noticed that it's become an asset, that it's become completely incorporated into him. He has a capacity, no, not even a capacity. He has a reflex now of being able to project moves 6 and 7 steps into the future. And, you know, Go, I tried to master it many times, largely because I felt I had to set an example for my students. And I didn't have it in me. I didn't have the capacity. I didn't have that, but my son, a mathematician, etc., somebody who was very at home, if you like, in almost arid and abstract spaces. But the point is that there are these pathways, the perception of pathways in the invisible. Now, I was interested in your invocation of Alberti, which I always find profoundly depressing. I'm sorry, I know I offend many people whose foundation is that. I just find it definitely prejudices an outcome to start anything with Alberti in architecture. But you know so much more about it than I do. And when you invoke that phrase, devise in the mind, and then realize through construction a transformation, shall we say, of the physical world. I found it fascinating because my experience as an outsider, so shall we see, I was not educated in architecture school, but I've been an educator. One of the things I find incredibly fascinating, and also on juries where I learned 90% of what I know about architecture. I know that in architecture school, nobody ever, in my experience, and I've got a fair amount of it now, nobody has ever been asked to devise in the mind anything. It is always get it down in drawing, do it on the paper, do it in the machine. And I have to say, there is something extraordinary about, we could say, the ecology of mind that existed, if you like, perhaps in the Renaissance, in an era in which even books were scarce. There were very, very few books, and those books had an importance that was such that one typically memorized them, and that they were committed to memory. In fact, I have to say, I just would like to say that in my early years at Columbia University, I know at least Neil, and certainly I hope Antoine will find this fascinating. I know most of our younger audience will think I'm talking about Alice in Wonderland, but in my first years as a graduate student at Columbia, I was a Renaissance, at that time, sort of a Renaissance specialist, and I was fascinated by the group around Cassirer. And one day, my teacher told me, you know, Sanford, I'm going to arrange a lunch for you with Paul Oscar Christeller. Paul Oscar Christeller, I don't know if I think Neil will know who he is for sure, and so will Antoine. He was the last remaining guy in from that neo-Kantian school from Germany. Now, Christeller had memorized every single manuscript up until the late 15th century. He knew you could give him any word, in Latin, of course, or in Greek. You could give him any word and he could tell you where it appeared in any existing known document in the West. And he was alive. He was alive in the 1980s. Anyway, that lunch was an incredible experience. This type of, anyway, I would like to say that the connection to these worlds. So I'd like to say, so in the game of Go, in this moment of Alberti, I think there is something that is very fascinating. So you invoke this game, and this history of Leach, who I understand from your account has retired. Now, of course, I was fascinated with the chess antics throughout the Big Blue days and et cetera, et cetera. One thing that I would like to say, just put it on the record as a provocation, is that one of the things that I find profoundly depressing is the existence today of people who think it's interesting or significant that a machine can win and can beat a human at Go or chess. That might have been interesting during the time when there were still those who were claiming it would never happen, but I just think it is the most banal and uninteresting fact. And I think the fact that we do think it's significant, and I really feel very sad for Lee Sedol, because I think there is actually no importance or significance whatsoever in that. It is actually an absolute failure to understand a much broader world that we're in. And, there is nothing that one can compare between a machine playing these games and a human. However, I'd also would like to say how fascinating that a machine could direct human attention, fascination, and even enchantment to the discovery of an entirely new pathway, because I do know that these guys have as close as is possible to a mental mastery of an abstract space as the Go players have. And I think that for them to be confronted by shall we say, by a virtue, I will use the word virtue because it's a kind of Albertian one, by an opportunity, or by a property, or by a capacity, by a pathway that they had not, that laid outside of their capacities for penetration, if you like. I find absolutely there is something of note. That is something of note. So I guess the final thing I want to say is, well, no, there's two things I'd like to say. What is appalling, in my view, is the incredible lack of effort that is being made, not only by our profession, but let's leave it at that, our profession, but also by the academic community, to reimagine. I don't even want to use that word now because somebody keeps invoking the idea that there's a crisis of imagination. I don't know what that means. I don't believe that that's a useful thing to say in this context, at least within this argument, but to imagine, or if you have to interrogate, or to create models, if you like, of understanding of what's happening today. There is nothing more instructive than looking at the ways in which technology produces forms of oblivion. I mean, that's the history of technology. As it sort of organizes social energy, if you like, around different regimens, it transforms, if you like, the socius. And I'm talking, of course, about its capacity to extract work from the environment. It redirects it, but it changes consciousness necessarily in the same act. It produces new forms of oblivion, and essentially what it does is it necessarily, but also shuts down certain portions of our own sentience, of our own nervous system. And that is why it's so beautiful to challenge ourselves endlessly. That is why the universe of Go is worthy of our attention, even if we're not going to become masters of it. It's worthy of our attention to understand how the game proceeds, how it continues to maintain a history. For example, the introduction of a new parti, which also opens up the window, if you like, to a whole new understanding of the capacities of, perhaps we could say, creative Cartesian reality. I want to make one thing certain, is I don't believe we should eliminate Cartesian thinkers, as wonderful and as learned as, and frankly, even as argumentative as Antoine and, let's say, his army. I think that this is the enrichments that we need because they provide us And
I appreciate being able to live a bit more. Thank you, Sanford.
That's great. But anyways,
Thank you for-
it's not for me to give permission to the Cartesian to flow. It's merely to say we make a big mistake when we shut anything down, except for stupidity. Now, in terms of the effort, I would like to say that 20 years ago, when asked to do a book on the contemporary city, on mutations, one of the things that we furnished at the end of our section on the contemporary American city was a micro encyclopedia of the history of technology. That's to say, a set of whatever it was, 8 or 9 excerpted documents that we felt would create a manual for how to think about the transformative history of technology. And essentially, that's what technology seeks to do. And the technology seeks to do that because it is a transformer. It is, and I would like to say another thing. This is the thing I wanted to say in the end. And where AI and the thinking about AI, honestly, I don't care that much about AI. I would say this, is if I were still in my 20s, there is no doubt that I would seek to be the most knowledgeable person in the field about AI, because I do believe that that is what needs to be, that is where so many of the problems of our coming age are going to be focused through. I just don't have it in me, to tell you the truth. But what I do pay attention to, as Neil does clearly, is the thinking about AI. And I find it, I find the best thinking about AI is not those who really approach the thought, who approached it in, who have written books specifically about robots and about AI. It comes from those who understood, may I say, the dynamo. I'm going to say it again, the dynamo that underlies the universe in which AI, like a life form, is now assembling itself. And that dynamo, I would like to say, are in the great teachers in the past. I mean, it really does have to do with the great economic historians. It has to do with a rereading, shall I say, of, and I say rereading because I don't expect much of the audience have read Lewis Mumford, but I know that the profession they belong to has, and that the DNA of the reading of Lewis Mumford exists in so many of their courses and in so many of the books that they love and cherish. And I refer to Mumford's, not Mumford's more explicit writings on architecture, but the way in which he produced a kind of a sweeping global approach to the history of technology. Now there are quite a number of others. I mean, we must understand how the clock operated in culture, and that is also one of the great cliches of economic and technological history. But you know, the architect needs to really understand what an extraordinary transformer the invention of the clock was, and how it made possible all these other things. The role of double entry booking. I could go on and on about this, but what I'd like to say simply is this, is that the greatest thinking about AI we will find in the brilliant works that have been done by historians and by philosophers on the equivalent technological transformers of the past. And the final note I would like to make, again, I would have to say, because my participation in this forum is going to be slightly challenged over the next several days, so I may not have as much time as had originally planned. I would like to say, we know it is one of the most depressing, one of the most awful, one of the least productive cliches under which we operate today, but it is also the marker of something of extraordinary importance when everybody refers to, and frankly, I do feel like sticking my finger down my throat every time I hear this word, one talks about the Anthropocene. Now, we know the Anthropocene is an object, is a topic, a concept that requires responsible address and attention. What it is telling us, and it is, it is a platitude, but it is also profoundly true. What is lacking is a proper imaginative description of what exactly that means. And I just want to say, we know that the human is the greatest transformer of all time, okay? There is no point in the universe, and there is certainly no place in our world, let's just say our universe, that where there is any entity that is of a greater transformer than humans. That, in a way, should be the center of our understanding, let's say the center of our positing of these problems. Maybe we need to begin to rethink a kind of and I say this with real trepidation, but I think that we have a sophisticated forum here, and I can say this in a way that I hope will produce some interesting and ironic ideas, a kind of neo-Luddism, you know. Now, I'll leave it at that. I will say that there is something that always fascinated me in my own studies of well, let's just say human sentience, and that is that stereoscopic vision was an extraordinary technological innovation that evolution provided to a certain line of the animal kingdom. It is often, you know, there are a whole set of developments that ensue from stereoscopic vision. But there came to be something very fascinating, a further distinction. I mean, it is often seen to be the predator, part of the cognitive predator organization. But what is important is, especially in the primate line, there were other forces, other organizational forces that interacted, shall we say, with the notion, or shall we say, with the operations and let's just say the cognitive or even the affordance universe that was created by stereoscopic vision, and that was the particular approach to territoriality. Now, the single point, I'm not going to go on about this, is the following. Baboons, another example, they have stereoscopic vision. They also can see, they also have lenses. They have the capacity to see very, very far, as do humans, as do chimps. But only humans will venture beyond the boundaries of their territory. You can chase a baboon, and in a way, frankly, I have to admit that I have done this. You can chase a baboon, and no matter how threatened it will run only to the edge of its territory in order to escape a fatal ending. And it will stop at the end of its territory and turn back. And it is a fascinating thing that humans have the capacity to go where they can see. And I believe that, in a sense, AI, because it's going to be very difficult for us to continually draw the boundaries of where AI can no longer go, because it will keep frustrating us in that attempt. But I do believe, well, we all know that, don't we? And that's really the basis of the fear that we rightly have about it. However, we must not believe that it is a force that we cannot modify, we cannot redirect, and that we cannot outrun. I do believe that in the human endowment, we must refocus, if you like, on what the capacities of the human endowment are, because frankly, we have to understand that 90% of them have been, as I said earlier in this, have already been eclipsed and shut down or redirected, and we have forgotten about them. So one of the things I would argue for is AI, and Neil had this implicit in his thing. AI we need to learn how to hack it, actually how to use it to augment, if you like, our own capacities. I'll leave that at that, because I don't know exactly the extent of my future participation in this forum, but I just want to say it matters a lot to me. I believe that we have a lot of young teachers in the audience. That's my guess. It's only my guess. I only would like to say that this there is this belief that we need to submit, if you like, to the forces around us, and that would be a great mistake. Thank you.
I want to make a suggestion here. I mean, I completely agree, and it's unfortunate we're kind of sandwiched between two different other kind of panel discussions. What I want to just float as an idea is, I mean, right after this, in about a quarter of an hour's time, there's another panel discussion taking place, and it involves one of my PhD students, but I can view that later. I can look at that later. We're going to have to shut off in terms of the live streaming, but there is the potential to carry on for a bit longer. And certainly, I'm totally fascinated by it's just been too difficult to make this happen, but I'm happy to carry on if anyone else is beyond the end of this session, as it were, on live streaming. Maybe I could just kind of comment on, ask Marrikka and Antoine whether you have a few more minutes after this to keep going, or whether you need to go.
I'm sorry to say that today I actually have to go.
Okay.
I have to go too.
Okay. All right.
And I think that should we each speak for, answer for 45 minutes to your talk, that's not my model of a conversation. So anyway, I have to leave at 6.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, 6 European time. I have a few remarks as for me, but they're a bit shorter. So I may just give them to you as they are. And then we can discuss that later. Some may intersect what Sanford said, some others won't. But first, I was a bit puzzled for somebody who started with Alberti by your kind of charge against history, as if there was an opposition between history and the future, which I find a bit simplifying. To begin with, architecture is as much a tradition as a discipline. And as a tradition, tradition, contrary to what is often assumed, a tradition is as much about change that it is about keeping stuff. So I think, why do we need history? Perhaps because history is not so much about fixing things, but the historian, the founder of the École des Annales, Marc Bloch, once said that history is about giving the imperious sense of change. So that would be probably the first thing. Then about the future, there I have to confess I'm a little bit along Sanford line. That's to say, for example, when you say that Kurzweil has been right so many times, but I would say that he's been so wrong so many more times. Don't forget that basically the singularity has been postponed regularly in Kurzweil writing. And, I think, Sanford, you used the word quack. That's a little bit the feeling I get sometimes. And the fact that he's on Alphabet board tells us more about the irrationality of very rational big business and the desire to survive and the desire to fight against death that animates so many Silicon Valley people, than about the seriousness of his vision of technological evolution. So actually, I was thinking that the future is actually a good subject for historians, because they're extremely good at writing a history of the future. So, and I was wondering whether actually focusing on the present, because I think the best part of your talk was more about the present, because very frankly, the general intelligence, etc., yes, why not? But frankly, we don't know anything. Frankly, at the end of December, we were not aware at all of COVID-19. So my guess is that we should probably be more aware that, it's pretty hard to predict the future except when it's past. So then I have a couple of unease, which I wanted to share with you. The problem very often when we, theorists, historian, whatever, all these people who are neither Rempulas nor, nor Bjarkingels, etc., are announcing the death of the architect. It looks a little bit sometimes as if, after years and years of giving talk less attended in architecture school than Rempulas or what's his name, Van Berkel, we were trying to say, guys, you're going to die like dinosaurs. So we're a little bit like, you know, the little mammals trying to tell the big dinosaurs that they're going to die. So, which I may have a sympathy for. Actually, I have a sympathy, and I do think that we're heading toward, as I, you know, where we share that distributed forms of you know, ways to be an architect, etc. So I'm sympathetic, but you know, in some ways, the death of a profession, you know, the profession has been strangely resilient to these days. So what I fear sometimes, aren't we trying to reassure ourselves as academics? Hey, guess what? I'm important because I'm the future. But so far, we're not even the present. So that would worry me more. So which would then lead me, I'm done in 2 minutes, don't worry, I'm a bit shorter usually than Cartesian, maybe, or Neo-Cartesian, maybe shorter than, you know, those who are holistic thinkers. So I think we do have a problem behind that, which is we're unhappy with a hierarchy. Because guess what? The design world is strongly hierarchical. At the top, you have the big dinosaurs like Kulas and others, under, etc. And then you have layers. And at the bottom, you find the young academic doing some obscure research on early 20th century architecture, whatever. So we're unhappy with a hierarchy. Which then lead me to things you haven't talked about really, because you talked about profession, but you haven't talked about hierarchy. You haven't talked about power. You haven't talked about the architect ego, which is such a powerful factor in this whole story. You haven't talked about authorship, because one of the big questions behind that is, you know, I'm not sure that it's the future, that it's about the architect, that it's about authorship. And I think authorship is a crucial question. So to conclude, I'm not as dramatically critical as Sanford, but Sanford is usually very good at being dramatically critical. But my main critique would be that there is no politics in this talk. And you know, architecture is so much about politics, and it's about power, it's about money, it's about hierarchy. It's a lot of unpleasant things. And you know, where I would actually join a little bit with Sanford is, you know, whether we have AI or not, these questions of power will still be with us as humans. These questions of social hierarchy, of who gets the money. You know, also architecture is also a profession in which a very small number of people get huge chunks of money, and a very large number of people have very small amounts of money. So very uneven. It's a little bit like the music world. So I was expecting more things along these lines, because they are the questions. You know, I think the future of the architect is how actually do you make a living? I'm sorry, I'm even more down to earth than you are, but I think power, politics, money, all these questions. And I do agree that AI, I'm not sure, to be honest, whether the human race will still be alive at the time when we have general AI, but it won't be because of general AI, but because of global warming. But meanwhile, I'm pretty sure that even if we have AI, politics will come. And then final note, let's not forget that humans are so cheap overall. You know, human labor is still extremely cheap in 1/10 of the world. So we tend also to forget that in developed countries, yes, labor is expensive. There are entire continent on which labor is extremely cheap. So that is also, for me, one of the problems that is at stake. You know, strangely, don't forget that the digital is using a lot of cheap labor in developing countries for call centers, et cetera, and not robots, actually. They're using real people in lots of places. So those were my reaction more in some ways. You know, yes, you have a point, but it would be good if you were to enter, you know, for example, the politics of architecture, because this is really missing in the picture. So it's a different entry by the end than Sanford. But I do think, you know, I really believe that a little bit at some point, AI will be what we want it to be. And what we want it to be is a political question. And I'm done, since we have 6 minutes before the hour and I have to go. But thank you.
Thank you, Antoine, and thank you, Sanford. I've just been checking with Chow, and actually we have to go off the live stream, but I can continue certainly myself afterwards to answer some questions. I feel really bad that we haven't had enough questions from the audience, and I'm totally convinced we've got some really smart people there. So I will make myself available. It's going to be a little difficult because as soon as you unmute things, then you get a kind of potential background noise. It's kind of difficult, but let's try and do that.
Why don't you ask Neil? I may stay a couple of minutes more, but why don't you ask simply people to raise digitally their hand and then unmute themselves only?
Oh, okay.
Otherwise, yes, it becomes total chaos. But they're relatively simple way to manage.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I do that, but yes. Yeah, okay, you're right, absolutely. Let's try and do something anyway. But Marrikka, I just want to.
I do actually have to go at 9 my time. I'm sorry to say, but just a few quick points, and I'll hold my fire for the day that I actually give a speech. I will say I was really interested that Sanford brought up the Luddites, and there's a wonderful collection of Luddite writings. I think edited by Kevin Binfield, I think his name is. That in which he mentions almost in passing that one of the most striking things about the literary efforts, which it's surprisingly, the archive is surprisingly copious of the Luddites, is that they tended to focus an extraordinary degree on the instruments capable of doing things. So they would it was like an early kind of intuition about a distributed sense of agency, which I think would actually be worth us revisiting. And maybe I'll do that in my final day of talks, of our talks. And then just one other thing, I totally agree with something that both Sanford and Antoine have mentioned. And it just generally tends to be one of our, to use the expression that Sanford so disapproves of, it is part of what I would describe as a